Yeah, I'm good.
So at the beginning of the year, the main problem I was having was in terms of marking within the confines of our controlled assessment guidelines. We're not allowed to give feedback in terms of controlled assessment stuff. So once they've started work on stuff, we're allowed to give extremely basic verbal feedback, but that's it. Which means in terms of, for example, Ofsted coming in or anyone actually coming in and checking my marking, it effectively looked like I wasn't doing anything. It was just sort of sitting there. I went away and came up with ways I could come up with some different ways of showing the progress of my students without directly having to mark coursework. And I was sort of working with Aaron, who implements a type of system in IT, and talking to Lindsay as well during sort of meetings and so on. What I came up with was a new tracking system. And essentially, what we have is I have a central spreadsheet which allows me to track step by step where students are with bits and pieces. And essentially this is the yearly breakdown of all of the coursework. So this is both our mock exams but also the different elements of the coursework that needs to be completed. So the top bit you've got there are things like the mock exams we do, so that now includes the most recent mock exam that you attended for us, okay? And that's colour coded as in they've met target grade, not met target grade and so on. And then as you go down, you'll find that the elements of our controlled assessment work and so on are actually then broken down. So the research that has to be carried out, the written components of it that have to be carried out. And essentially once students complete that, the most I do on, say, research, which again is classed as coursework, is I tick it, confirm it's done, or I'll verbally say to the students, you need to go away and have another look at this and think about what you're doing. Once everything's been completed, it then gets ticked off on my spreadsheet. But what the students have also got is on the back of their folders, they have their own version of this sheet, which is a central sheet just for them. And again, that gets ticked off as work's completed and grades get filled in and so on. Essentially what it means is that anybody comes into the classroom, they can pick up the folder, turn it over and see exactly where the students are in terms of the coursework that's been completed and so on. It also means the students know exactly where they are as well. Oh, I've done this, I haven't done this, and so on. Once I'd implemented that, and then during the new batch of sort of lesson observations and everything else, the feedback I got from that was the students now know exactly where they are in terms of the coursework. It's easy for them to see. And again, for SRT coming in, they could see that marking was taking place and so on and so forth. The other thing we implemented though was this need, particularly after mock exams and mock controlled assessments, was to give a proper way for students to receive feedback on where they were. So tied in to this tracking sheet are new feedback sheets. So essentially attached to a mock assignment or a mock exam, students now get this. I've actually got a load of these. And essentially what you've got on here is at the top you've got a complete breakdown of each question and the grade they got and what level they fell into. So all of our questions are marked out 4 levels. So it tells them exactly where they are and then obviously gives them their overall grade. They then have the current mark boundaries for their units as well, so they know exactly in terms of where they are, how far they are off their target grade and so on. And then what we've got underneath is the actual marking criteria that's been converted into student speak. So rather than sort of the term that exam boards like to use, this is a breakdown of, in order to move to the next level for each question, this is what you need to be doing and this is what the exam board expects from you. And again, students have this and they use this to then work alongside their red pen that we then do after the exam. So my year 10s received their feedback for their mocks this morning, for example, and alongside this, they then on separate paper, which they then attached to the exam paper, and this, their comments and their own feedback and everything else, again to show their understanding and so on. And then I will mark the red pen and just confirm they've written down the right things and so on. And essentially by using that sort of method where we get the students to, even for their actual controlled assessments, write red pen comments once they receive verbal feedback and me marking the red pen, I'm not marking the coursework directly, but I am confirming they've received the right idea in terms of what direction they need to go in and so on. And it has made a difference. If we look at sort of the mock exam results and so on, you've got the grades there. For most of the students there has been some improvement. Some, we've had some slips, but for the most part improvement has been made forward. They now understand what they need to be doing for the coursework and so on, and how to improve their overall grades. It's going to take time, I think, for it to filter through, and obviously as we move into year 11, we're seeing in particular what impact this has on the current year 10s that are using it. But we're going to go straight off with this as well with the new year 10s that are coming in, and we've also implemented it with sixth form as well now, so they have a similar tracking sheet that lives in their folders. They can tick off the work that needs to be done, and again they receive breakdowns after mock exams and so on, telling them this is what the exam board expect of you to be doing, and this is how you move forward. So that's really the sort of the main thing I've implemented this year and try to change in an effort to work within the controlled assessment guidelines, but also help the students have a better understanding of the marking criteria and so on. The second thing I did this year was in terms of our practical projects. We only do one practical project with GCSE students, and it can be quite difficult sometimes to allow them to see what makes a successful project. You can obviously show them past projects, you can tell them what grade they received and everything else, but it's actually being able to apply the marking criteria and see it. So what we did this year was, rather than us standing at the front and saying to them, this is one of the past ones and this is the grade we got them to mark the actual past work using the exam criteria themselves. So rather than us standing up and actually saying this is the grade, we handed them a sort of pro forma for marking. Now this is essentially a very boiled down version of the marking criteria, but it covers what is needed for a successful practical project. And the exam board state that in order for a successful A-star piece of work or practical, these have to be used to a high standard and efficiently. So that's the grading criteria. So what we did this year was we started off at the beginning of the practical unit by asking the students, showing them the video, going through the marking criteria step by step, and then asking them to make their initial evaluation. Typically, first time round, they come in under where it needs to be. They tend to mark quite cautiously. So we use that as a first time round. We tell them where they might have gone wrong and so on. Then we do it again. And we actually repeated the process about 4 times by the time. And by the time we got to the third and fourth piece of the work, they were marking to the same sort of standard and the same levels that we have marked coursework to. And then we come back to it routinely as we're going through and continuing work on the practical project. And it just allows them to see that, in fact, this isn't just like a list of criteria, this can be applied and it can be used. And now, when you talk to the students and they're planning their work, they're actually sitting there drawing up their storyboards going, hang on a minute, we need to put that range of camera angles in, we need to make sure that when we film this, we've got everybody's heads in. They're using the criteria to actually apply it to their planning. And obviously, we'll see what happens when they actually go out and film and where they are, but all indications are they now have a much clearer idea of what needs to be done in order to create a successful production. And that's it, really. It's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily anything sort of revolutionary, and I'm sure people do similar sort of things, but these have worked well within the media department, allowing us to keep moving the students forward and so on.
So with this, Dale, is this where we were talking about that you had the question, it automatically generates these responses?
So there's different ways of doing this. So IT, for example, have an automated spreadsheet which works in terms of the way they create things because of their BTEC marking skill. It doesn't quite work for the sort of GCSE stuff, but what I have is a program called Text Expander, and essentially what it is once you've set it up once, when you're in Word or whatever program you're using, you type a keyboard shortcut and it comes up with a menu that simply asks you to tick what you need to go into the document. As soon as you've done that, it then formats everything, dumps into the document and you move on. It took me about 10 minutes to create an entire class's set of feedback sheets once. So it takes about half an hour to 45 minutes to do the initial setting up, but this criteria applies for any one of the courses, and in fact will apply for year 10 and 11, so that is now there ready to go. And so once you've set it up, it's very quick and easy to turn out a complete list of feedback sheets for the students.
So the points that are here, so like for example, identify 2 conventional elements, is that only relevant to this exam paper?
So this, this is the criteria for the current criteria they use for the exam paper, unless they change it come summer, which is possible. But this is based on the last set of criteria we had for the 2015 papers. So at the moment this is correct. What we have found is it typically only change 1 or 2 words changed, and that's about it. So again, it's easy enough to change in that template, and then it's just able to.
So these are for longer responses, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
Because obviously, like if it was a smaller mark question, the responses would be more specific. So these are like longer questions.
Question 1 is 10 marks, and typically is about half a page to a page. And then questions 2 and 3 are 20 marks each, and that's around 2 to 3 pages worth of sort of working. And then 4 and 4A are typically again half a page to a page each.
And the mark schemes are always the same then, are they?
In turn, the only thing that typically changes, the mark boundaries tend to change slightly. Every year so far they've brought the grade boundaries up, so what is required in order to get a grade goes up every year by a mark or 2. Last year for our 2015 papers they gave us a 10 grade difference between what was needed for an A and what is now needed for an A. They do like pushing things up quite a lot.
Yeah, but like, I mean things like, so here like it says use terminology.
Oh yeah, that tends to stay, that stays the same. The concept of where they apply the terminology and sort of their theories and things doesn't change.
So this terminology would be listed on the mark scheme,
yeah,
but then obviously you're just saying that they need to be more accurate with the use of.
Yeah.
So like because I'm trying to think for us, we do like a lot of long mark questions. But say for example, one long mark question might be on the body systems.
Yeah.
So for example, it'd be talking about maybe the heart and the lungs or so on.
So
whereas another question might be to do with training methods. So there's different terminology.
Yeah, I mean question 2.
So you're just using an ambiguous one.
Yeah, I mean question 2 they know focuses on the 4 areas of camera work, soundtrack, editing and meaning on scent. So they know that's the soundtrack. We've got the advantage of that at the moment. Our questions in the GCSE are the same every year, they don't change. We know question 1 is looking at the components of an action adventure film, question 2 is about terminology and using camera work, editing and scent, question 3 is always representation. Whether or not that stays the same sort of thing when we change in 2017 to the exam board, but at the moment, from the first week in year 10, those 3 questions that I've gone over and over, so they know what needs to be covered.
Right.
So yeah, so terminology is quite a general term, but they are aware of what needs to go in there.
I mean, what strikes me is your knowledge of the exam board requirements and the mark scheme, and I think that's absolutely key, that you've unpicked every question and you know in detail what you need to do, and you're able to give that information to the students as well. So there's that whole thing that must inform your teaching, and then the other thing is that no one presumably gets left behind because of you're constantly doing this feedback, and it's very personalised feedback as well, isn't it? Then you've got the ability to make sure that no one does get so far behind that you're playing this catch-up that we often have in year 11, where somebody's having to go back and redo work that they did at the start of year 10. Dan, it must lend itself to you thinking about the long questions and history as well, and on picking them a bit.
Yeah, we've done something fairly, I've done something fairly similar where, so I haven't kind of gone, this is what you need to do to get to the next level. I've gone, this is what you need to do for a top answer. So these are the components that you need to do for the longer based questions. So I'm just thinking about, well, actually this is even more eloquent because it's actually directly tailored to each student. So
With the first iteration I tried this in some form last year, I did just put what was required for level 4 response, and I actually found that some of our less academic students turned off because it was too big a jump for them, whereas what I do is I only deliberately put the next level from where they are now, so they have something to work towards and feel it's, and then hopefully from the next mock, when they've gone up to that level, I can say, right, you've got there, this is how we now get to that level 4 response. And it seems to work really well for them. They feel it's easier to move up one. Even today I had a couple of students turn around and go, okay, I've got 44 marks, which means I'm only 4 marks off my C, and then start looking down going, well, I can easily bring that one up to the next level, and they feel more comfortable making that jump.
Understanding the mark schemes is massively important. That's how we've gone sort of backwards with our teaching in the context we teach from the mark scheme first. So when we do an exam question, we will use the mark scheme first before we do the content, because they've got to understand the expectations, and that's what's changed our teaching in the GCSE and the A level, is the understanding of underpicking exactly what's needed in the responses, because that is key, definitely.
And then everything you're teaching has a focus, doesn't it? Because they're already understanding that you need that to add in. But I think that idea, Dan, you're unpicking even more, because giving them the confidence, because you, Dale, you end up with very disparate groups in Key Stage 4 for media, from very, very able kids to those that need the loads of scaffolding. So that whole idea of saying every single one of you can make progress, and this is how you do it, and then celebrating those little sort of mini steps, make sure that you do keep a lot of those, potentially disaffected kids on board with media, which is brilliant. I think this is one of the key things they feel as if they've got some ownership and can do it.
That's really powerful to see, it must be for a student to see that, mustn't it? To see, I think that's really good. It's great.
So we probably just need somehow to understand how we can use this to save loads and loads of money as well, which would be really useful. And maybe we could add that to your film somehow.
I mean, the program I use is primarily a Mac program, but there are equivalents out there for Windows-based systems that anybody can set this sort of thing up. It is actually quite straightforward once you get your head around it. You just go. But so what I've created, for example, Patrick has access to the same program, and I can share what I create. So we have a central database, so it's almost like a comment bank on reports. We both have access to them, we can both use them. So in theory, once they've been set up once, they can be shared between an entire department with no problem at all. And again, that saves on time. So one of you puts that initial time in, but then it's available for everybody.
Could you let us know what an equivalent would be?
Yeah. I'll get George to put some links out along with the videos.
That'd be really helpful, because I haven't got a Mac, so that'd be good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Is this, in terms of your pen back, is this kind of, essentially just like...
So, because that was the biggest problem I had with that, I couldn't put tons of green, I couldn't mark stuff. And I think the one suggestion I got was I could print this out in green, but other than that.
That's amazing, it's really good.
So, yeah.
I like it, even the grades with like this is actually each question.
Yeah, this is where you were and this is what you're not.
It's all sort of,
yeah.
What is this?